Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine-Israel. I'm Mark Hage. We're going to turn our attention first tonight, once again, to the question of starvation and the use of famine as a weapon of war by the State of Israel against the people of Gaza. Our first documentary was produced by Al Jazeera's Fault Lines, and it makes categorically clear that Israel is deliberately blocking delivery of food, water, medicine, and other vital humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. In one segment, Stacy Gilbert, a former employee of the State Department who has since resigned in protest, makes it abundantly clear that the charge that Israel is not blocking aid to Gaza is patently, demonstrably false. Her words. Here now is Fault Lines, Starving Gaza.
لا أعتقد أن أحد هناك في شمال قطاع غزة لديه كفاية من الطعام. والأعداد أكبر من الطاقم المتواجد في قسم سوء التغذية.
Every day, the cries of hungry children fill the halls of Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza. Some children here at the malnutrition clinic have never known a full meal in their lives. After the Hamas attacks on October 7th, Israel cut off fuel, food and water from Gaza. Within weeks, starvation had spread in the north. Israel doesn't allow foreign journalists into Gaza, so we worked with Palestinian reporters who filmed for us at Kamal Adwan Hospital in June. Abdul Aziz is 5 months old and starving. Dr. Ahmed Nasser has been taking care of him with what little resources the hospital has on hand.
حالة خطرة جدا. الطفل لا يستقبل أي شيء في جسده، يعني أي شيء بيدخل الجسد بيتم إخراجه بدون الفائدة للطفل. الأم كانت أيامها قادمة للمستشفى نتيجة أن الطفل يعاني من إسهال مزمن وتقيؤ، وطبعا ارتفاع في درجات الحرارة، ارتفاع حرارة الجسم. في كتير فجأة بتظهر لك حالات بشكل مفاجئ بشكل كبير، يعني بتلاقي مثلا في يوم من الأيام بتلاقي لك مثلا 30-40 حالة نفس السبب. ياخذ الله شيء طبيعي حاليا؟
بس عادي يعني مش كثير. قعدوا يمكن 10 أيام فيش حليب صناعي انقطع من البلد كلها. فابني عانى من جفاف شديد جدا بحياتي كلها. ما قلقتش هيك قلق. خايفة لا سمح الله ان انا يعني افقد وشيء.
شوف هذا. سامشي؟
On the second day of filming, Abdul Aziz's heart stopped.
يلا بالعجل. لا عشان السجيه بدنا السجيه. شوي.
حطيت ادرينالين يا جماعه اتروبين. بسرعه يا علي بسرعه.
Doctors resuscitated him, but he remained unconscious in intensive care. The following week, on June 30th, Abdul Aziz al-Hurani died. He was one of at least 38 people in Gaza who've died of malnutrition since October 2023. All but one were children. Israel and its most powerful ally, the United States, deny that aid to Gaza is being blocked. But our reporting has found that Israel has restricted the flow of humanitarian assistance since the start of the war, creating one of the worst man-made famines of the 21st century.
إشي صعب علينا، إنه كيف فقدنا الولد بسبب جوع صعبة.
When famine starts, it takes the youngest first. It's been 5 months since Hanan Assaf and her husband Mohammed buried their 2-year-old son, Khalid. This is Khalid in happier times, before the war on Gaza and the starvation that followed.
هذه الحرب دمرت كل شيء. بيوت، البني آدمين، الشجر، الحجر، كله تدمر. هذه غرفة ابني الصغير، حرقوا لنا إياه الاحتلال، ما خلونا ذكرى لا أي حاجة. الولد ما كان فيه ولا أي حاجة للأمانة يعني. فجأة الولد بدأ يزن، أكله خف لأنه مش موجود الأكل. كان هو متعود على اللبن، رز، فواكه ياكل الولد، وهذا طبعاً من بداية الحرب بدأ يخف شوية 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 لحد درجة إنه انقطع نهائياً. ما كان فيش موجود أبداً إلا الخبازة، ما فيش شيء في السوق، والأسعار خيالية إذا موجود. ولد صار شبه هيكل عظمي، خلص بالمرة يعني، حمله زي المولود. بطل الولد يقدر يقعد ولا يتحرك ولا يمشي، ضعف جسمه نهائياً الولد. أخذته على كمال عدوان، ما كان في طب ولا في علاج أساساً. آخر يومين حطوه في العناية على الجهاز التنفسي.
Khalid died of severe dehydration and malnutrition at Kamal Adwan Hospital on February 2nd, 2024. Fears of a famine in Gaza started as early as the beginning of the war. Israeli leaders announced a crippling blockade in response to Hamas's attack on October 7th, in which nearly 1,200 people were killed. 251 were taken captive.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
לא נאפשר סיוע הומניטרי של מזון ותרופות משטחנו לרצועת עזה.
Israel launched an unrelenting bombing campaign ahead of a bloody ground offensive. Gaza's health ministry says more than 40,000 Palestinians were killed since the start of the war, most of them women and children. And now famine has spread throughout the Gaza Strip.
بتروح على القسم سوء تغذية تحت.
لم يتم تسجيل أي حالة سوء تغذية ما قبل الحرب.
Dr. Ahmed Nasser is 28 and only 2 years out of medical school. He's a pediatrician at Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza, where the most serious malnutrition cases are treated. His staff of 8 is responsible for hundreds of starving children.
غالبية الحالات بتيجي في إسهال مزمن، بتيجي في أمراض في الصدر، لأنه في النهاية سوء التغذية هي تؤدي إلى ضعف للمناعة. كان هذه الأعراض أكثر ما ظهرت بعد 5 شهور من الحرب، وبلشت الأمور تزداد. فالكثير من الأعراض اللي ممكن طبعاً من ضمنها اللي هي ممكن تؤدي إلى الوفاة.
دكتور أحمد، السلام عليكم. ممكن تشرح شوية الوضع اليوم؟ كيف الوضع اليوم في غزة؟
صراحة الوضع الحالات سيء، وفي طرد عدد كبير من الحالات. بالنسبة للقصف في الأيام الفترة الأخيرة بدأت تزداد الوتيرة كثير في شمال القطاع.
أول مرة ردت أسألك في رأيك منو المسؤول عن الوضع في غزة؟
الاحتلال الإسرائيلي هو المسؤول الأول في النهاية عن اللي بيصير في قطاع غزة بشكل كامل.
ما فيش أمان في أي مكان من ناحية القصف والصواريخ والقذايف. بعدين الأكل والشرب مش متوفر. أنا بخاف أفقد حدا من أطفالي بسبب الجوع لأني فقدت طفل. قبل كنا نفكر كيف بدنا نجوز أولادنا، نودي أولادنا جامعات، نفكر في المستقبل يعني. هل لقيتها ما بتفكر أصلاً إلا إنك تقدر توفر لأولادك حالياً الأكل والشرب خلاص.
Israel has maintained a partial siege on Gaza since 2007 after Hamas was elected. Before the war, an average of 500 trucks of humanitarian aid and commercial goods entered Gaza each day. Now it's less than half that, despite the desperate need. And for months, the trucks that did try to get through were attacked by far-right Israeli groups as police and soldiers did little to stop them.
إحنا ناس مدنيين ما إلنا بأي مشاكل. من أبسط الحقوق يتوفر لنا الأكل والشرب لأهل غزة.
By July, independent UN experts said there was a full-blown famine in Gaza. But Israel says that isn't true and blames aid shortages on humanitarian groups. The US won't publicly admit Israel is blocking aid, which is a war crime.
It is widely known and documented in the humanitarian community and the US government that Israel has been blocking humanitarian assistance since the start of the Gaza conflict.
Stacey Gilbert was a senior officer in the US State Department and specialized in humanitarian assistance. She resigned in May after the Biden administration concluded Israel isn't blocking aid.
They have made a policy decision to support Israel unconditionally.
We conducted more than 20 interviews with the UN, aid workers, and former US officials. They described how Israel restricts aid, denies deliveries, and creates bottlenecks. What are those specific ways of aid being blocked?
It's everything. There are administrative obstacles, not enough customs officials checking these items. The food that goes bad because it's waiting on the trucks, so it's like a spigot. They turn on, they turn off. They decide that some things can't go in, other things can. Aid workers' visas are denied or delayed, and when the pressure builds, they will allow more assistance in, but then the spigot gets turned off again. So Israel and the United States government will say, look, some assistance is going in. It's never been enough. And they know that.
The US gives Israel billions of dollars in security funding each year. There's a US law that prohibits arms transfers to countries that are blocking humanitarian assistance.
The administration deliberately denies the facts on the ground because it would trigger consequences to cut off security funding. It allows the weapons sales to continue. The weapons are the engine that fuel this war, and we are not taking responsibility for our role in it.
And even when aid crosses the border, Israel makes obstacles for humanitarian workers to deliver supplies inside Gaza. Checkpoints, damage to roads, and lack of coordination delayed aid distribution and worsened the hunger crisis.
We were hampered almost every single step of the way in the missions that I went on. There's a lot of restrictions on our access to places, which results in delays or even danger to staff.
Tess Ingram was delivering aid to Kamal Adwan Hospital with a UN convoy in April when it came under fire near an Israeli checkpoint.
Gunfire broke out and bullets hit the vehicle that I was in.
Here, and then I went here. This one, here.
My door and my window of our armoured vehicle.
Do you know that it was the Israeli military doing the shooting, and who were they targeting?
I know that the shooting came from the direction of the checkpoint, and it seemed to be aimed towards these apparent civilians who were just to the east of our convoy.
Did you reach out to the Israelis about this, and what was their response? Did they investigate what happened?
We were told that it wasn't from the direction of the checkpoint and that they weren't involved and no investigation was conducted.
Did you manage to get the aid delivered?
We were held there at that holding area for hours more, to the point that the mission wasn't feasible, and we had to turn around and go back to Rafah. So these sorts of delays that really prevent us from doing our job, and at the end of the day, it's the kids that pay the price for that. And that is heartbreaking. And how do you explain that to a mum who is asking you, what can you do for my child?
Nearly 300 aid workers have been killed so far. The majority were Palestinians working for the UN. This has been the deadliest conflict for the organisation since its founding. UNRWA, the UN Organization for Palestinian Refugees, says many of its facilities and convoys have come under attack despite coordination with Israeli forces. Israel has tried to dismantle UNRWA for decades. It's considered the backbone of aid delivery. If it collapses, no other organization could take its place. It's not just delivering aid that can be deadly. Scores of civilians have been killed while collecting it. In February, more than 100 Palestinians seeking food from aid trucks in North Gaza were killed, and hundreds more injured after Israeli forces opened fire on them. It's known as the Flower Massacre.
So when we hear of the Flower Massacre, it's not one isolated incident that was some accident.
We partnered with open-source investigators at Forensic Architecture to examine the data behind attacks on people seeking aid. We found more than 40 attacks.
We saw so many videos of people being attacked in similar circumstances. So we actually went through all of those videos and we geolocated as many of them that we could, and we plotted them out on the map.
The work we are doing is identifying the repetition of certain tactics. Then we can start to establish a pattern.
As we looked into more of these attacks, we started to see that they were systematic in nature and not arbitrary.
Looking at it like this, seeing that they're all concentrated here and here, could that be a coincidence?
No, so those specific points of concentration, those are where civilians come to receive the aid.
The investigation revealed that Israeli attacks didn't just kill civilians seeking aid.
We also have attacks on bakeries.
They also destroyed key infrastructure that received humanitarian assistance.
When aid is initially distributed, flour is distributed to bakeries, bakeries are targeted. When aid starts to be distributed to schools, then schools become the target.
Forensic Architecture documented 16 attacks on bakeries between October and November, sometimes while people lined up for bread. And 107 shelters that received aid had been destroyed up until January.
We have attacks on aid personnel. This includes civil service workers like police.
Then, at the start of the new year, there were attacks on police and civilians who escorted humanitarian convoys.
Police had to suspend their operations in escorting the convoys. After that, World Food Program had to suspend its operations as well. And then tribal communities started to step up to facilitate aid. And then we see strikes on those communities, specifically targeting those people.
So this is purposeful. This is a purposeful military tactic, according to the data.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing you can conclude from that is that the consistency of attacks shows that it's systematic in nature.
I mean, Israeli officials say over and over again that they are not intentionally denying the people of Gaza aid and that they are not guilty of starving Gaza.
I think the evidence points to the opposite.
They're creating essentially a chilling effect so that it sends a clear message that if you're receiving aid, if you're planning aid, if you're working with it in any capacity, you are at risk, you're in danger.
We asked Israeli authorities about the findings of our investigation. They did not respond.
مجتمع الدولي في النهاية ما تم فعله من الاحتلال الإسرائيلي على مرأى الجميع والكاميرات جميعها. ما تم إيصاله إلى الإعلام هو جزء من المأساة والمجاعة التي يعاني منها السكان شمال قطاع غزة.
The Biden administration has refused to condition US weapons on Israel improving the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The measures the US has taken, from opening a pier to airdropping aid, have largely been ineffective.
عندك رسالة للسياسيين الأمريكيين فشي بسيط إلا نقدر نقلهم أي شيء شو تريدنا نقلهم؟
وأبسط حل إنه في النهاية فتح الحدود يعني بشكل كامل لوصول المساعدات في جميع الأهل في شمال القطاع وسواء قطاع غزة بشكل كامل. أبسط شيء ممكن تعمل انتهاء الحرب.
Famine is not a foregone conclusion in a conflict. Famine happens when assistance is blocked. It is the outcome of a deliberate decision.
In April, Stacey Gilbert was asked for her input on a Biden administration report on whether Israel was committing war crimes in Gaza.
I was shocked to see that it said in very clear terms, It is our determination that Israel is not blocking humanitarian assistance.
You had advised that that wasn't the case. Is that correct?
Yes. The subject matter experts were removed, and the report was moved up to a higher level. We were told you will see the report when it is released publicly.
And then the report comes out and just doesn't include what you had to say?
I wasn't sure I read that correctly. I read it again, and I sent an email then that I would resign as a result of that.
Do you remember what you wrote in your resignation email?
I said that report will haunt us. And it does, and it haunts me. The determination that Israel is not blocking humanitarian assistance is patently, demonstrably false.
We went to a press briefing at the US State Department to ask about Washington's support for Israel as famine has spread throughout Gaza. We've had aid organizations and relief groups who've said over and over again that Israel is using starvation as a tactic of war. How do you respond to the allegations of complicity of the US government, and what more will it take for the US to stop Israeli military funding?
So it is the United States that has secured all of the major agreements to get more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Going back to the very early days, the first week after October 7th, when the secretary traveled to the region and the president traveled to Israel, and together convinced Israel to open Rafah crossing to allow humanitarian assistance in. It has not been enough. There are obstacles. Sometimes those are logistical obstacles coming from Israel. Sometimes those are the nature of moving humanitarian assistance around in an armed conflict.
Under US law, it is required that any country receiving military support must not obstruct the flow of humanitarian aid during war. And every major rights group, from the United Nations to Human Rights Watch, has said that Israel is using starvation as a tactic of war. Do you disagree with them? And are you, one final question, are you not afraid of completely losing legitimacy, of being seen as being hypocritical when it comes to supporting human rights in one country, but not when it comes to Palestinians?
Let me just answer the first question. So I would encourage you to read the report that we issued on this very question 2 months ago that looked into Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law and their work and whether they had done a good enough job to let humanitarian assistance in, where we said that there were some roadblocks that needed to be overcome, and we had worked to overcome those, and we had seen Israel take steps to allow humanitarian assistance in.
When the President of the United States has to ask Israel to allow assistance in, that effectively is an admission that Israel is blocking humanitarian assistance.
By the US not adhering to its own laws, do they have blood on their hands, the US government?
Yes. We have made a decision not to control the thing that we have control over, and that is our military support to Israel. Even when we know they're blocking humanitarian assistance, which is a violation of our law.
When famines happen, it means many lives are already too far gone to save. Long after the war ends, Gaza's children will likely feel the effects of starvation for the rest of their lives.
الموضوع الستردي حيستمر لفترة طويلة حتى أن تصبح الوضع في شمال قطاع غزة إلى ما كان عليه سابقا ما قبل الحرب. صورة صعبة جدا أتخيل على الطفل. ففرصة النجاة للطفل في شمال قطاع غزة هي فرصة شبه معدومة.
In August, 5-month-old Mohammed was admitted to the hospital in serious condition. His mother Hana says he needs a special formula that's not available in Gaza. Like every baby at the hospital, the entirety of his life has been shaped by this war.
هو انولد في 11/2 في عز المجاعة، في عز النكبة، يعني في عز الكارثة في الحرب. ما كانش في غذاء للأم تيصير غذاء للطفل. مرعوبة إني أفقده في أي لحظة.
يجب أن نألف هذا الأمر. يجب أن نرفض بشكل يومي حدوث هذه الإبادة أو المأساة أو الحرب التجويع التي تكون في شمال قطاع غزة. الحقيقة هي أسوأ مما توصل إلى الكاميرات.
Our last report tonight was also produced by Al Jazeera, its award-winning program, The Listening Post. Over the course of the last 12 months has been examining how the United States media and important media outlets, corporate media outlets in the Western world have been reporting on the genocide in Gaza. This particular episode sort of brings together what is discovered over the course of the last year. And what's clear is that those corporate media entities are deliberately concealing the truth from us about the crime of genocide and other events in Gaza. Here now is the Listening Post inside the Western media reporting on Gaza.
This is a moment in history that we don't often see, where we actually see genocide being perpetrated as it's happening. And in a situation where Western governments like the United States, the UK, and others have been complicit, you've got Western media that have actually become a part of the mechanism of genocide. That's what's different. That's what's frightening.
When political leaders speak of genocide, they repeat a time-worn mantra, never again. Over the past year, for the Palestinians of Gaza, again has become reality. A genocide broadcast almost in real time by its victims. This is a film about an alternative version of that reality, one told by major Western news organizations, how they have provided cover for an historic crime and have seen their inner workings exposed like never before. We have spoken with more than a dozen journalists who have been covering the Gaza genocide for the Western world's leading agenda-setting outlets, including the BBC in the UK and CNN in the US. Both describe a repeated failure to report the truth on this story.
Prior to October 7th, I hand on heart believed that CNN went to great lengths to report the truth, and exclusively the truth. But after October 7th, the ease with which I saw news lines that supported the Israeli narrative come out really shook me. There were times where CNN was happy to push hard, but on balance, it's very clear where we lie, regrettably, and it's not entirely with the truth.
Gaza has massively exposed the hypocrisies at the heart of the BBC. The fact that it very much does respond to influence, it very much can be swayed. It does follow the government line broadly on certain stories. The BBC is meant to be a public service. It's meant to be for the people. But at the end of the day, its purse strings are held by the government. And that you can see in the coverage.
The October 7th attack by Hamas, in which more than 1,100 Israelis were killed, almost 800 of them civilians, was the deadliest day in Israel's history. As they launched their retaliation, Israeli officials made clear this was not just a war on Hamas. Everyone in Gaza would be fair game.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible.
But, as with any genocide, the first step was to dehumanize the enemy.
Bloodthirsty terrorists who rape and burn people alive, and it's been reported on the BBC.
What happened on October 7th included acts that were bad enough in and of themselves. But if you want to create a context for dehumanization and genocide, you need to go further.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
We saw false reports about beheaded babies, which never happened, about a systematic campaign of mass rape, which never happened, about babies being cut from the abdomen of their mothers, which never happened, and a whole series of other horrific atrocities. These were deliberately concocted official stories that were being provided in particular to a Western audience in order to create an atmosphere in which the crimes that were to follow would go on unchecked.
Shortly after October 7th, Israel sealed off Gaza's borders, including to foreign reporters. The Palestinian journalists left to tell the story would soon be killed at an unprecedented rate. Israeli forces quickly set their sights on Gaza's healthcare system. One by one, hospitals, swelling with patients and refugees, came under attack.
The difference between this genocide and the other wars that I had been in, the wars in Gaza, the 2021 war, the 2014 war, the 2012, 2009, and even the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the comparison between them and a genocide is the comparison between a flood and a tsunami. In Gaza, 50% of the wounded were children, and they remain so. The massacres never stop, the operating rooms never stop, and even when you're doing that, you then discover that you've only treated a small percentage of the wounded.
Israel wanted to begin a campaign to start taking out all of these medical facilities. In part, they were concerned that Hamas combatants were going to be treated in them, but also this was part of a war of annihilation to try to force the Palestinians in Gaza into a constant state of motion, moving from one place to another. Nowhere is safe for you, not even a hospital.
A home, a school, a hospital that hosts terrorists is not a home, is not a school, and is not a hospital. It's a terror base.
The Israelis were pumping the public with information that was meant to convince people that hospitals are not really hospitals.
Hamas was using the patients in that hospital as a human shield.
And this was a narrative that we saw unfolding almost from the beginning.
By November 10th, just over 1 month into Israel's assault, half of all hospitals in Gaza were out of service. One of them was the Rantisi Children's Hospital, which Israel bombed and then raided after it claimed Hamas was using it to hide Israeli captives. Once inside, military spokesperson Daniel Hagari said Israeli forces had found proof and gave CNN special access.
Evidence, Hagari says, points towards Hamas and possible hostage presence below the hospital.
Hagari showed CNN's reporter, Nick Robertson, a document on the wall, which he claimed was a roster of Hamas members keeping guard over Israeli captives.
This is a guarding list. Every terrorist has his own shift.
This became quite an embarrassing moment for CNN because it wasn't a Hamas roster at all. It was a calendar, and written in Arabic was the days of the week. But the report that came out from Nick Robertson just swallowed up Israel's claim.
To make matters worse, the allegation that the calendar was a Hamas roster had already been debunked on social media the day before the CNN broadcast. According to multiple CNN journalists and an internal WhatsApp log that we obtained, a Palestinian producer alerted her colleagues, including Robertson, but was ignored. The report went out, first on television, but there was still time to correct it before it went up online. Another producer tried to make that case.
One colleague saw the report and flagged to Nick, "Hold on, people are saying that this is not accurate." And apparently Nick said, "Are you meaning to say that Hagari is lying to us?" So there was a chance for this to get stopped, but Nick was adamant and it went out. He's a very experienced correspondent. If you are trusting the Israeli government over your own colleagues, then you need to have your wrist slapped at the very least, because your reporting has given cover to the Israeli operation.
No proof would ever emerge of captives held at the Rantisi hospital. Meanwhile, Israeli forces had turned their attention to the Shifa hospital, the largest in the Gaza Strip, responsible for 40% of its healthcare capacity. They began by releasing an animated video of a tunnel network beneath the hospital, which they described as Hamas's command and control center.
The White House and Pentagon today confirmed my reporting yesterday that the U.S. has intelligence suggesting Hamas is operating a command center under the Al-Shifa hospital.
As Israeli forces closed in on the hospital, those claims were repeated, often with little to no pushback on Western news outlets.
And did the IDF show you anything that resembled an actual command and control center?
What we saw, Kana, was a pretty sophisticated-looking tunnel.
The New York Times and other news organizations began to then create their own renditions of what they, I guess, imagined Hamas had underneath Al-Shifa Hospital, promoting the narrative that something very nefarious is taking place. That was the moment, and you can trace it, that the floodgates were opened for the Israelis, that they perceived that they now had a green light to wage war against Palestinian hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza.
Do you have what you need to treat people?
So we've run out of burns dressings, and there are over 100 patients with burns covering over 40% of their bodies.
One of probably the most distressing aspects about that period when I was working at Shifa Hospital is that we were getting hundreds and hundreds of wounded. The bombing around Shifa was continuous. And so you'd get phone calls, and all the Western journalists wanted to ask about was, when you walk around, do you see any tunnels?
Israel continues to maintain that beneath it in underground tunnels, Hamas has a command center. Is this something that you're aware of?
So, I mean, first of all...
And if you say that I've never seen any of the tunnels, then you are dismissed immediately.
After 2 weeks of bombing the Shifa compound, Israeli forces stormed the hospital on November 15th.
The target of the war is to defeat Hamas.
Once again, Daniel Hagari was there to show the world some weapons he claimed belonged to Hamas, alongside some tunnels, many of which were built by Israel in the 1980s. Nothing that remotely resembled a command center. Since the raids on Shifa and Rantisi, every hospital in Gaza has been attacked, put out of service, or demolished. Witnesses have described mass executions, including of patients and medical staff, testimonies that barely register in the Western news cycle.
أصعب إشي والخوف اللي شفته لما كانوا يطخوا النزلان قدام عينينا وكانوا يفحروا الجوار ويحطوا 5 6 بقلب جورة ويدفنوهم.
Mass graves were found, with hundreds of bodies.
Over 800 health workers, doctors, nurses, paramedics who've been killed. That kind of dismantlement of health was a critical component of the genocidal machine, because what that did is it ensured that anybody who's wounded die of their wounds and that anyone with a chronic disease would eventually die of that disease. You add to the mix the famine, and so the wounded are now dying because they are malnourished.
This, they say, is a Hamas tunnel that connects to a tunnel network underneath the Al-Shifa hospital.
The Western media was critical to the process of demonization of the Palestinian health system. And what is shocking is that when the Israelis went into Shifa and there were no real evidence of these bunkers, these media outlets did not recant their original stories.
Jody Rudoran spent 2 decades as a reporter and an editor for the New York Times. She rejects the idea that these features of Western news coverage are the result of any inherent bias.
I begin from a premise that most journalists who are covering conflicts are doing so because they believe that bearing witness to what governments and terror groups do to each other is critically important to the functioning of democracy and of a civil society. These people are trying their very hardest to do the very best that they can. What I think is not true is that there is any kind of systemic bias, like in the structural editorial processes of these newsrooms. I think these newsrooms are trying to report a 360-degree view of an extremely complicated storyline that many of the actors in the storyline don't want to acknowledge the complexity of.
Western news outlets are not monoliths.
Israeli soldiers have been filmed standing over stripped and kneeling detainees in Gaza. But these are medical staff.
Arjumana Karachi and colleagues spent weeks documenting an attack in January that killed more than half of the members of one family.
Many mainstream journalists do try to speak truth to power, and their reporting has, at times, undercut Israel's claims, exposed its war crimes. Journalists at the Times, CNN, and the BBC have told us it can be a struggle to get those stories past editors. Israel's denial of access into Gaza has made the job even more difficult. But it's the larger trends rather than individual examples that shape the effect that media coverage has on audiences. On the Gaza story, they have been quantifiable and point in one direction. A study by the news website The Intercept of post-October 7th coverage by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times found that Israeli deaths were covered on average 16 times more often than when the victims were Palestinian. Words like slaughter and massacre were used to describe attacks that killed Israelis at least 60 times more frequently than for mass killings of Palestinians, when those terms were almost never used.
The New York Times headlines are filled with volume after volume of story where Palestinians appear to have been killed in a mysterious attack waged by no one. Palestinians are always referred to as dying in the passive tense. It's very clear that there is an agenda from the leadership of the New York Times, and that's been attested to by whistleblowers in the newsroom who said that it's very clear that they're steering coverage in particular direction and that Palestinians are subjected to a different set of standards than Israelis when talking about their deaths, their sufferings, or their perspectives.
There was a massacre on October 7th. There were atrocities committed. It was barbaric. I think those were appropriate words to use, and the response was intense. It involved a lot of death, destruction, and displacement. But I'm not sure that massacre, barbaric, and atrocity are appropriate terms, certainly not for the full scale of the war. There are individual attacks within the war that may, where some of those words may be appropriate. So it's just, you're talking about two very different things, and they deserve different adjectives.
For Sarah at the BBC, double standards could also be seen in the selection of interviewees and how they were treated. In the days after October 7th, the BBC set up an internal group chat in which producers could vet potential interviewees based on their online footprint. We have obtained messages from that chat which Sarah says was used disproportionately against defenders of Palestinian rights.
It was overwhelmingly guests on the Palestinian side of things who were being looked into. Palestinians being flagged up for using the word Zionist, which isn't something to flag necessarily. Even the occasional NGO was thrown in, for example, Human Rights Watch. These are organizations that we've really relied on in terms of covering Ukraine and various other conflicts. And now and again, they would check an Israeli guest. But there was no balance in what was going on. Israeli spokespeople who we did have on were given a lot of free rein to say whatever they wanted with very little pushback.
Babies were set on fire. Babies were shot in the head.
Whereas any Palestinian guest was asked to condemn Hamas.
But I want to ask you specifically about Hamas's actions today. Do you support them?
Almost as though condemning Hamas was the sort of price to pay before they could be humanized in our coverage. Many of our own presenters, when faced with an interviewee who was Palestinian or who had lost family in Gaza, there was just such a lack of compassion.
I'm sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?
As a result, a number of producers were really reticent about putting a vulnerable Palestinian guest in front of a BBC presenter.
The mounting double standards have provoked a backlash in the newsrooms of many Western outlets. Journalists at the New York Times and the BBC have resigned publicly, citing their consciences. Others have tried to change things from the inside. BBC staff have repeatedly complained to the network's Director General. One email we obtained, signed in February by more than 20 journalists, warned the corporation's coverage risked aiding and abetting genocide. Staff at the Times leaked details of an internal rebellion over a now notorious report that claimed Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th, an allegation that was exposed as baseless. 70 journalism professors have demanded the Times do an investigation into that report. The Times did conduct an investigation, not into its story, but to find the source of the leak. Numerous journalists we have spoken to describe variations of the same theme: interference from executives and editors, the kind they have never faced on any other story.
There's a divide between the many good journalists within CNN who jump through so many hoops to tell the true story and push back from high-level management demanding that you tone down criticisms of Israel. There was a period of time when we couldn't call airstrikes in Gaza airstrikes unless we had confirmation from the Israelis.
A massive explosion at the largest refugee camp in Gaza. Joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht.
It's really depressing because we would not be doing this in any other place. We would not tolerate the need to ask, say, the Russians whether they bombed a hospital in Kiev. So the double standards are really shocking. You try and change managers' minds, you feel like you're making progress, and then something happens, and you feel like you're back at square one. For example, more recently, on the day that 40,000 Palestinian deaths were announced, Mike McCarthy, who's number 3 in the organization, said in the morning editorial call that we need to contextualize and hold Hamas accountable. And that was reflected in the framing from the shows.
The Gaza Health Ministry says more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed since the October 7th Hamas massacre in Israel that triggered the war.
Multiple journalists, in emails, in meetings, have raised concerns about a lot of the things I've said in this interview. The disparity in the language used, the inconsistency in approach compared to other story areas like Russia and Ukraine, the lack of humanization when it comes to Palestinians, the lack of context about this conflict before the 7th of October. And it hasn't really made a difference because there's just a sort of unwillingness among the executive to accept evidence. For me personally, it meant I could no longer see my future at the BBC.
The lessons learned in 1945, if mankind would remember them, could make the world a better place for all men.
In the wake of the World War II Holocaust, Western governments built a new international legal order, a central pillar of which was the prevention of any future genocide. Since the early stages of Israel's onslaught in Gaza, experts on genocide have been sounding the alarm. In January, the International Court of Justice described a case accusing Israel of genocide as plausible. 2 months later, a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories found that the threshold for genocide had been met.
We cannot avert our eyes. We must confront genocide. We must prevent it, and we must punish it.
The decision by the United States and its allies to continue supporting Israel diplomatically and militarily makes them complicit.
And may God bless the great alliance between Israel and America forever.
And that has put those news outlets and their journalism to the test, caught between the positions of their own governments and the realities of international law.
This mantra that Israel has a right to defend itself, which has been repeated over and over and over again in Western media.
Israel has a right to defend itself?
Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
Israel has a right not only to defend itself, but to seek the military destruction of Hamas.
Yes, Israel had a right on October 7th to repel attacks on its territory, but it has no right under international law to make war on the Gaza Strip, a territory that, according to the law, it has occupied for 57 years. So that little rhetorical device of claiming that Israel has a right to defend itself has been used and abused in Western media to provide justifications for wholly unlawful acts.
Israel has a right to defend itself. That was the editorial line that was drilled into us, into all of our coverage. It was really an integral part of the editorial stance. To a guest talking about, Israeli airstrikes killing Palestinians in Gaza, that would be the response from our presenters.
Denying access to food is collective punishment, and that we should all be clear in saying that.
Israel will argue, obviously, that it has a right to defend itself.
People were terrified of using the word genocide in coverage. They still are. You will very rarely see it in any BBC coverage. And if an interviewee says the word genocide,
this is a genocide happening in front of our eyes.
That word is, as you know, incredibly emotive, and the Israelis, as you know, will be saying that they are targeting Hamas only.
The presenter will almost always panic.
The Labour Party, of all political parties, which has always had a strong peace contingent within it, is now actually supporting genocide.
Okay, if we can maybe just avoid that language, if that's okay.
Having destroyed Gaza's healthcare system, Israel has laid waste to virtually every town and city there. It has slain more journalists in 1 year than were killed in all of World War II. They are among at least 41,000 Palestinians killed. And experts say the real death toll could be several times higher, in excess of 150,000. The response from Israel's primary Western allies has been one of denial about the depths of the horror and their own complicity. As for the Western world's most influential news outlets, they have suppressed the story, amplified the Israeli propaganda that has accompanied it, and downplayed the telltale signs of genocide.
Western mainstream media have invested a lot in trying to draw a curtain across this genocide and disseminating an alternative narrative that makes the crimes happening in Gaza somehow justifiable. And the reason this is so dangerous is because it creates room for Western countries to create a cloak of impunity, and it creates a sense that some countries are above the law, that might makes right, that all of the efforts to build an international order since the Second World War governed by the rule of law may begin to crumble.
It is impossible to overstate the role that the incendiary media coverage played in the events that would unfold after Hamas and its allies broke down the fence that surrounds Gaza.
You're not Hamas. Israel is a democracy, and as a Jewish state,
supports and believes in every life mattering.
Israel was able to perform in front of the world a master class in manipulation of the media. And so you had a narrative set that Netanyahu and Biden on their own would not have had the power to drill into the minds of the public, but for the existence of major Western news organizations promoting it for free.
In the future, when we have a museum for this genocide, we will have a special place where we put the pictures of the journalists who allowed it to happen. There will be a wing for the CNN and the BBC and the Times journalists who were the enablers of the genocide. The Palestinian people will remember them.
That's our program. As always, thank you for watching. We'll see you soon, I hope.